Good morning. Welcome. My name is David Lewis. I am president and co-founder of a group in Fairfield County called the CEO Roundtable. And on behalf of our group and the CBIA, I want to welcome you to today's forum. This has pretty much evolved out of a lot of activity over the course of the past year as it relates to trying to find ways to stimulate business activity and growth within the state of Connecticut. And over the course of 2011, certainly on the state level in particular, there was a lot of effort made to be able to create some opportunities to stimulate the economy, create a better environment for business within the state of Connecticut. And between the CEO Roundtable, which is a group of 30 business owners, mostly small businesses in the area, who meet to discuss the issues that we're all facing in our respective businesses, and the CBIA, of which I'm a member of the board of directors, we got together and decided that it would be helpful to bring the panel together before you today to discuss what efforts have gone on to this point and what other efforts we could possibly put into place in 2012 and beyond that would stimulate additional business growth and business activity to make Connecticut as friendly an environment as possible for businesses in the state. We have invited Tom Appleby to moderate today, and I'm going to hand the program over to him now. Thank you.
Thank you. I know you're thinking, why him? If he's so smart, why isn't he in Davos? It's just that I'm not that into skiing. And I didn't think our governor was either, for that matter. We're going to move things along very quickly today so that everybody gets a chance to say something and on each topic, and you will have the opportunity to weigh in as well. There was supposed to be a means by which you would get questions to us. If that doesn't happen, we'll just throw it out to the floor at some point and just have you shout out your questions. And each of our guests, to keep things shorter, will introduce himself and then respond. And roughly, they will have about 3 minutes each to respond. And then in addition to the lawmakers, the panelists will have a couple of minutes to respond. And then the lawmakers again, and then we'll make our way to you. So let's begin. I guess we'll just do it in the order in which they're seated. State Senator Scott Franz is from the 36th District, and that is Greenwich, New Canaan, and Stamford.
Thank you, Tom. Can everybody hear me okay? We had a little, okay, great. Anyway, good morning, and thank you very much for the chance to come and speak with you on the panel today. Also, I want to say thank you on behalf of state government for doing what you're doing in the Connecticut state economy. Without you guys doing what you do in business, we wouldn't have jobs, we wouldn't have revenues coming to the state, to Hartford, we wouldn't have an effective state government. So thank you for that. That never gets said enough. I know it's a tough situation out there with the economy. Although we've hit the inflection point, I know it's still challenging. It's the greatest recession that we will have ever seen in our lifetimes, probably multiple lifetimes. So thank you for all your efforts to continue to allow your companies to survive and hopefully get back on a growth trajectory. The question today that we're supposed to be focused on is how do we keep this recovery going? It's a somewhat anemic recovery, and how do we get the economy to grow at a better rate going forward, both at the national level and also here in the state of Connecticut. I don't think there's a state in the country whose economy is not dependent on the national economy, especially when it comes to a recovery. We are certainly dependent on how the U.S. Economy does. So therefore, we have to make sure that the national economy does have a robust recovery. We'll come back to that in a second. But what's interesting about the Connecticut economy is that there's usually about an 18-month delay between when it recovers and or after the national economy recovers. And our job, Representative Cafaro and myself, is to make sure that this time around that 18-month delay or lag time is not increased because of something that we've done inadvertently or intentionally up in Hartford, such as putting in laws like paid sick days, which is not exactly the most business-friendly kind of legislation that we could have. What we need to do is we need to figure out a way to get our fiscal house in much better order so that we're a more attractive state for those business decision makers who are thinking about coming to Connecticut, and certainly for those who are here in Connecticut and considering leaving the state. We have to play very good defense before we play offense. So the national economy, how do we get that to recover on a more robust basis? As I said, we've definitely hit the inflection point. The most recent data is we're growing at 2.8% on an annualized basis. How do we make it grow a lot better? And a lot of economists have come out and said that 2.8% is really a false number. Don't get your hopes up too much, because everybody's just replenishing inventory. Very simply, take the uncertainty out of the system. Healthcare, universal health care is a big unknown. We don't know what it's going to cost to hire an incremental employee 8 months or a year from now. We just don't know. Create a much more predictable scenario when it comes to tax rates and other burdens on businesses, and create a sense of hope and optimism that's based on something real and something demonstrable and something to really look forward to from an economic point of view. Then we can take the chains off of this slowly recovering economy and expect greater growth. Larry and I are here as representatives of state government. We're going to assure that we do all the right things in Connecticut to assure that we enjoy the same kind of recovery.
And now Congressman Jim Himes from the 4th District.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Can everybody hear okay on the, it's all right? Okay. And let me reiterate Scott's thanks both to the roundtable and to all of you for doing what you're doing in creating economic vigor here in Connecticut. Necessarily, I'll probably take a slightly more national perspective than as a federal representative than Larry and Scott will. But nonetheless, I think I would echo a bunch of the themes that Scott threw out there. Look, we're in a unique moment right now where we've come through the worst of a devastating recession, as Scott said, probably, hopefully, the worst that any of us will ever see. And I do think that there's some things that we could do in the near term to take that 2.8% GDP growth rate and accelerate it, or perhaps to put a little bit more vigor into the recovery. But I don't think we're likely to do them. And then there's a bunch of things that we could do, that we must do actually in the long run, to assure nationally, but here in Connecticut, that we have the kind of growth rates that we saw in the last several decades in the coming decades. In the very near term, our fundamental economic problem in the country today is an issue of aggregate demand. Our economy is our GDP is 70% consumer purchases, and of course the consumer out there, and I don't care if you're in Connecticut or Michigan or California, is still very nervous. And the chief factor behind that, of course, is ongoing weakness in our housing market. The devastation, the recession, of course, was catalyzed and largely driven by an asset bubble in the housing market, coming out of all sorts of things, deregulation, all sorts of bad government policy, irresponsibility, and all that we know and saw in the financial services market, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, whatever. Looking forward, you've got millions of Americans out there underwater on their mortgages. And when you're underwater on a mortgage, you're not out there buying a refrigerator or eating in the local restaurant or buying a new car, and that creates a demand issue. In the very near term, what we could do, but I suspect we won't at the federal level, would be two things. A more aggressive program to try to stabilize the housing market, and it gets pretty technical, and if you want, we'll go into it. But, I think we could have been much more aggressive about principal write-downs for mortgages with some mechanism for appreciation on the banks that took those write-downs. But we didn't do it, and I don't think it's likely to happen under present political circumstances in Washington. The other thing that we could do, and I've been pounding the table on this one for 3 years, and certainly here in Fairfield County, so important, is investing in our bridges, our roadways, our railways, our airports, our electrical grid, and using that as a stimulative mechanism. We know we're going to spend this money. We are not going to let our bridges fall down. We're not going to let our rail lines come to a screeching halt. And if we were to make the commitment to invest now, of course, we'd be putting operating engineers and carpenters and electricians to work, who in turn would go out and buy those refrigerators and eat in the restaurants. So, again, not likely to happen under present political circumstances in Washington. In the long run, look, as I travel the district here and listen to employers, in the long run, we need to First of all, make sure we've got a financial services sector and a capital market that is as liquid and robust and vigorous as it always has been. Of course, with a little bit of the risk that we saw in 2008 hopefully removed. I've done a lot of work on that on the Financial Services Committee in Congress. And then, again, in the long run, we've got to educate more. Macton, OEM, M-Cube, 3 companies, manufacturers in the northeast corner of Fairfield County, all saying, I've got openings, I can't find the people to fill these openings. So educate more, make sure that every kid has the capability to start their own business or to be a good employee at one of these manufacturers. Trade more. One of the few things this Congress has achieved was Korea, Colombia, the trade agreements, Panama, that ultimately will help our export sector and manufacturers. You know, find the right balance. Find the right balance between government providing the infrastructure and the catalyst and maybe some of the basic R&D, a la the internet, that allows the private sector, all of you, to do what you do so well and generate economic activity and economic growth.
Thank you, Congressman. Just want to remind you to turn these off if you haven't done it already. Larry Cafaro is the House Republican leader from the 142nd District, which is Norwalk.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everybody. You know, when David introduced himself and introduced this group, he described you as small businessmen and women. And you are that. And as my colleague said, you know, thank you for that. But you're also mothers and or fathers and parents. You're the people who volunteer at the Little League games or coach soccer. You're the people who help out at church or synagogue and at the PTO meetings all over the state of Connecticut. You are the backbone of the state of Connecticut. And you don't ask much from us. You don't ask too much from us. In fact, mostly lately you say, do me a favor, just stay out of our way. Let us do what we do best. Let us make a living for ourselves and the people who we can employ. Help us employ more people. Just stay out of our way. Now, we can't always do that, obviously. The role of government is important, and we have to make sure that public health and public safety are followed, etc. But boy, I think we could do a heck of a lot better way to do 2 things. One, to change the culture of government so that it is welcoming and inviting to you, so that it encourages and incents you to do what you do best. We could also make it less difficult to have you do what you do, with less regulation, less prying. And we as a government could do a better job of fighting with each other a lot less. And I'm 54 years old. I've been around politics for a while, and I have to say that this is probably the most partisan time in government, both at a national level and even at a state level. Back in October on the State House, we tried to put partisanship aside and say, let's come together for the good of our state and those that we represent. And I think we did that in a very effective way. It's my hope that we could do that again and continue to do that. But that all started, by the way, with things such as this, where we listened to you. We didn't talk at you or tell you what we think is best for you. We listened to what you need from us. And hopefully that's the way we could proceed as we go forward. And I'm looking forward to this dialogue and this conversation. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joe Brennan, the Senior Vice President of Public Policy for CBIA.
Morning. Thank you. I want to thank Dave for asking us to participate in this forum this morning. As we go around the state talking to our members, we are hearing some good things finally after a long time, particularly among some of our manufacturers that are busier than they've been in a long time, starting to produce more product. We're hearing other good things, but there's still obviously some major challenges facing the state of Connecticut. Hopefully we'll get into these this morning, but just to touch on a couple. Obviously the fiscal situation. We're hopeful that we go through a session that was pretty quiet, but news of late between the Moody's downgrade, some differences of opinion between budget offices relative to savings that we'll get from the state pension, whether we're in a deficit for the current fiscal year or not. It's got nothing to do with blaming anybody for it. It's just looking where we are, what can we do going forward to get that under control. Because at the end of the day, we need greater confidence among investors, business people, that Connecticut is a good state to invest in. You can make a reasonable rate of return, grow your business here, and we're not hearing that from our members. We need to instill that sense of confidence in people that Connecticut is back and we're going to be successful. And I don't want to just take all Larry's lines, but I'm going to agree with a couple things he said. As we talk to companies and location experts that make decisions on where to locate operations, we always hear the same thing. It's just harder in Connecticut to get things done. Between regulatory processes or zoning changes at the local level, whatever it may be. And Governor Malloy, I think, has done a good job of bringing some new people in, some new blood in to run agencies that are listening to the business community, working with us to try to make it a little bit easier to interface with state government and local governments to get things done here. And the third thing I'll mention, and Larry again talked about this, and I've been around long enough that I hope I'm not naive anymore. And I know we're in a very political environment, but the bipartisan approach last fall, you can argue whether the jobs bill did enough or whether you like the direction it went in, but the fact that we could have agreement between the two sides, we were only going to do things that both sides agreed to. We don't see that elsewhere. And if that could set a new tone, and it's not going to be like that on everything. Again, I'm not naive. I know there's always going to be partisan differences, but at least on something as important as the state's economy, getting us back on track and putting people back to work, if that's not important enough for people to come together and understand that there's good ideas on both sides of the aisle, and if we can have a new tone in Hartford going forward, at least around economic issues, I think we can start to turn the state around.
Thank you very much. David Lewis, you've already met. He's president and CEO of Operations, Inc., and also president of the CEO Roundtable.
Good morning. And again, thanks to the panelists for agreeing to be here and for Tom for agreeing to moderate. Speaking from the perspective of both the CEO Roundtable and as a small business owner who services so many companies in Fairfield County, I think a lot of the things, I'm going to take only a minute or so here to just echo some of the things that have been said here already. I think the people that I talk to, do want less government, but also at the same time want more government. I think we tend to talk out of both sides of our mouth. We want less government when it's impeding our ability to move forward, and more government when it comes to things like incentives and the jobs bill. I think to Joe's point, I think the idea that there is a bipartisan exercise that just went forward this past year in the state to be able to get the jobs bill going, regardless of exactly how much it will do, it's a step in the right direction, and I think we need to see more of that. It's difficult at best, though, I think, to just put the onus on the state. I think that we need more at the federal level, if that's feasible, to be able to see both the bipartisan exercise and effort versus the logjam, as well as just some type of movement in a direction that creates real incentive to stimulate real growth. The state's issues are going to be here no matter what. We're still going to have 95 in the Merritt Parkway, and the inability to be able to get in and out of Fairfield County and get to work each day without having to sit in a ton of traffic. I don't see anything changing all that much in the near term as it relates to that, but creating an environment where this state winds up in the top third versus the bottom third in terms of states in which to operate as far as its friendliness to business is certainly a goal that I see the state moving in that particular direction, and we want to see more of that and hope that today's discussion will lead us in that direction.
Thank you. Gentlemen, do you want to respond to what you've heard so far?
I think the points are very well taken. Representative Cafero's been involved maybe a little less directly in economic development for a long, long time. I've been involved in economic development in the state of Connecticut coming up on 20 years now, mainly through the Connecticut Development Authority, and more recently in the state Senate, sitting on the Commerce Committee as the ranking member for the last 3 years. So we're familiar with all of the challenges and the problems that you've alluded to or described specifically. And we try like crazy up in Hartford to assure that we're doing everything to improve the business climate here in Connecticut. We're not, as you all know, having as much success as we'd like to have. We continually get ranked in the bottom 5 out of the 50 states in the country, and it's for a variety of reasons. You all know them because you face these challenges every day. It's a high-cost structure state. It's a high-cost state government state. Fiscally, Connecticut is not in fantastic shape. As we all know, Moody's just downgraded our debt to AA3, and that in some ways was kind of a gift to us. It could be worse. When you look at the state's balance sheet, we don't really have a balance sheet, but when you look at the equivalent of the balance sheet, you look at something close to $100 billion in unfunded liabilities, most of which are pension liabilities. We're hopefully going to be addressing that. Governor Malloy started to at least, acknowledge that it's a problem. How we get to the solution, we're not sure. But hopefully there's a bipartisan solution to that. There are things like that we're going to continue to focus on and make sure that the business community is aware that there's a contingent up in Hartford that really genuinely cares. There's nothing like a good, strong economy. It makes all of the social ills that we're so familiar with go away, and a job is the greatest social program known to mankind. So that's what we're fighting for up there as a team, and hopefully we'll have more success going forward, and we'll be in the top 5 instead of the bottom 5 of the states in terms of business attractiveness.
Sure. One thing I'd like to add is that, we're starting to see a little bit more of in Hartford, which is a sense of urgency about this, because for too long it was frustrating. There was a report that came out several years ago from a group, I believe it's called Global Insights, where they were looking not backwards, because we all know Connecticut's job growth has not been great looking backwards, but looking forward, so over the next 5 years, that Connecticut would rank 50th in the nation in job creation. And, we wrote a lot about that, talked about it. We got criticized by a lot of people in Hartford for being too negative, and we said, look, we're not trying to pull the state down. We want to wake people up that, national experts are saying we're going to be dead last. And that should have caused outrage among people, and for some reason there just was a lot of complacency about it, that we're just kind of accepting the fact that we're going to be behind. And I think now, due to the efforts of, as I said, particularly around last fall, having a bipartisan effort instead of a partisan effort around the economy, that we saw a little bit greater sense of urgency. And I think going into this next session, we're hopeful that we'll see the same kind of attitude, that we're not going to accept being in the bottom 5 or dead last. It's just not acceptable. Connecticut really should, with all our attributes, we really should be, not just in the top third, but we should be, I think, in the top 5 or 10 states in the country. When it comes to the intellectual capacity we have in this state, the diversity of industry that we have in this state, all the different advantages you all know about and contribute to. I think we have to set higher goals than just, getting out of the bottom, because we have the ability to do that if we can all pull together. And again, I don't mean to sound naive, but I do think that we have an opportunity now that we all have to grasp to move forward.
Tom, and I'm sure, Jim, you experienced this in Washington. I think what we've heard from businesses, whether it's their plea to the federal government or to state government, is please give us some certainty. Give us some stability. It is easier for us, say many of you, to do business, predict, and be willing to invest and to grow when we have confidence in a stable set of rules and regulations and processes. When things are willy-nilly, when one law contradicts another law, when there is constant instability in state finances, which force states to change their policies year by year, thereby affecting us as businesses, that's what prevents us from taking that extra step to invest money in our own businesses, from hiring other people. There's a sense of uncertainty out there that maybe if I just hold, I'll wait and see. And once they think, well, okay, we've now laid out a path where we're going to stay on for some time, no sooner do we do that, we change a direction again. And business folk have been saying to us, please get your own house in order. Give us, at least for a 5-year clip, a certain and stable set of rules and processes that we could rely on as we make our investment decisions and our hiring decisions. That's the biggest challenge of government, because those uncertainties, they don't come out of a dislike for business. God knows we all want business to grow. There are different ideologies and different philosophies that say, well, we think this is best, we think that's best, and in many cases, it contradicts each other. It's like a schizophrenic state government, I've called it. You know, we talk about jobs being a number one and priority and growing the economy, and yet we'll take either steps with regard to how we tax our citizenry or various rules and regulations that could go completely contrary to that. And you folks as business people react to that. I'm not going to grow this. I'm not going to put the addition on my plant. I'm not going to hire 5 more people. I don't know what's ahead in the next session. If this state is so unstable, what are they going to tax next to get that revenue? And that's what I think our biggest challenge is to give the citizenry and the business community a sense of stability and certainty, at least 5 years at a clip. And that's when we're going to see some growth.
I'd love for the theme of education and the way we link our educational institutions not get lost here. Larry, you make a good point about uncertainty. Coming out of a devastating recession generated by a housing market and the financial services bubble, there's only so much you can do. I mean, as a former businessman, when you saw a quarter of negative 8% GDP growth, and you don't know if a quarter a year from now is going to be +4 or -6, that's the uncertainty that you really can't address is when you're coming out of the abyss. One thing that and the reason I want to bring it back to education is look at, I'd offer this. What are the most vibrant, economically productive, wealth-creating regions in the United States? Right? And I'll just throw these out. I don't know if these are exactly right, but they're close, right? I'd say Palo Alto, I'd say the Route 128 corridor around Boston, and I might say Manhattan. Now, those are jurisdictions that have a couple of things in common. One, extraordinarily high taxes, fairly significant and substantial regulation, probably working against economic growth, but all 3 of those locations have very good links with their educational communities, right? Out in Palo Alto, you've got Stanford, you've got all the universities out there, Route 128, Lincoln Labs, MIT, all the universities in Boston. Here, we've got pretty substantial educational infrastructure, and I'm not sure that we have that kind of link, where people are leaving Yale or UConn or any of these universities at the clip that they do in those other locations and say, I'm starting this new business, I'm starting this biotech, I'm starting this high-tech business. And by the way, it's not just our universities in high-tech and biotech, right? It's better coordination, better commitment and investment in our community colleges, because the jobs that are going to grow here in Fairfield County, and if you guys know this better than I do, but I don't know that Fairfield County has a future with low value-added commodity manufacturing. If all you're doing is taking a piece of metal and bending it, it's going to be very hard for Fairfield County to compete with southern states where wage rates and energy are much lower. We're going to be about value-added. We're going to be about innovation, about high-end welders, about engineering skills and whatnot. And I think it's absolutely really, really critical that we get that interaction, not just with our universities, but with our community colleges as vibrant as possible to try to mimic the growth that we see in those 3 regional jurisdictions I talked about before.
You know, I think certainly the economy in Fairfield County is very much a white-collar economy. And, you know, you look at the market from a perspective of trying to find individuals who will come to work for your company who are going to make less than $70,000 a year, and your challenge starts right there. Those people cannot live, for all intents and purposes, in this county, and therefore they have to commute into the county, and then now we're dealing with the issues with 95 and with the merit. You know, a lot of the people that I talk to, on the one hand, as I said, we talk out of both sides of our mouth. We want less government, we want more government. You know, there's been state programs that have put in place that are creating at least the impetus for businesses to go ahead and to grow their companies and to do the hiring, and I think the JET program is a great example of that, and hopefully something that will lead to that type of growth. But I think the one thing that everybody is still saying, and at the roundtable meeting we just ran this past month, you know, one of our members made a very succinct point that it just still feels like a roller coaster, that we are not standing on cement, we're standing on sand. And a lot of that starts at the federal level, in terms of, you know, where are we as far as getting to a level of stability when it comes to the deficit, when it comes to the economy, it's going to all fall back to that. And I don't think it's fair to put the onus on the state to be able to have to solve those problems. I think the state's ultimately dealing with its own issues, and I think doing certainly an admirable job this past year of being able to try and move things forward in a partisan way. But speaking for a lot of small businesses, stability starts sort of at the top here, and it's looking for some indication that the go-forward plan for the country's economy is going to breed stability, because if it gets to that point from a federal level, I think the state level ultimately is going to follow in hand.
I think that's exactly right, and as we all know, democracy works pretty darn well in this country, and we're at that point in the cycle now, which coincides with a anemic recovery that we're experiencing. I know 2.8% sounds pretty good, but that's not a real number, again, because a lot of companies are just replenishing inventory stocks. So there's going to always be uncertainty when you're at this point in a presidential election cycle. And if you look at just the Republican primaries alone, I mean, how volatile that whole experience has been for the top two candidates, or the four candidates, I should say. That's kind of reflective of, what's going on in Washington as well. There's been a lot of gridlock in Washington. Hopefully, knock on wood, we have all the right changes in all the right offices so that we can break those log jams going forward, and that we have some certainty. There's nothing worse than having to anticipate either paying huge sums of money in terms of being able to meet all the requirements of universal health care 18 months down the road, or not paying them. Is it going to get repealed? Is the Supreme Court going to knock it down? All that uncertainty means a tremendous amount in terms of the basic, hiring decisions that decision makers make, in the private sector. They don't like, if they know it's going to go up by 14%, for example, for each incremental employee 18 months down the road, at least they know what the number is. They might not like it, and they might not hire as many people, but they know what the number is. They don't have a clue what the number is because of gridlock and because we're going through the tumult of the election cycle right now. And hopefully that does get sorted out here in the not too distant future. I mean, it certainly will by next November, but hopefully even before then.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think you make a very good point. Look, Scott alluded to the unfunded liabilities in the state of Connecticut. Very serious. Not nearly as serious, of course, as the unfunded liabilities at the federal level, by which, of course, I'm referring to the liabilities that emerge from largely our social insurance program, Social Security and Medicare. Huge. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about our budget deficit, which is a big number, but I tell you, it's a rounding error almost compared to the unfunded liabilities with Medicare and Social Security, and to a lesser extent, Medicaid. That is a major project, right? And there was a crack taken at how you make it work by the Simpson-Bowles Commission. This was the President's Debt Reduction Commission, which I'm sorry to say the President walked away from, or at least didn't embrace, a year ago when it came out with its proposals. But it's a mistake to think that that when those proposals or proposals like them are adopted, that it's necessarily going to be good for the economy. What I mean by that is, look, I'll be the first in this room to say we have to get at the federal level our fiscal house in order. We've been very lucky in that inflation has been negligible. Treasury yields, which indicate people's confidence in the solvency of the federal government, are at record lows. That cannot continue in the long run. So it's something that we have to do. But let's be very clear about what it's going to involve. You can fix any deficit in two ways, and every elected official up here knows that. You can cut spending, you can reform social programs, or you can raise taxes. None of those things are stimulative. So, a wag at the Washington Post described the federal government this way. It's kind of funny, but it's also very accurate. Ezra Klein described the federal government as an insurance company protected by a very large standing army. And he made that point because that's actually 3/4 of federal outlays. Social Security and Medicare, which are social insurance programs for our elderly, protected by a military which is larger than the militaries of every other country on the planet combined. We're experiencing right now 115 layoffs in Connecticut at Sikorsky. Why? Because the cuts that have been voted on at the federal level hit the Pentagon, and those translates to fewer jobs at Sikorsky and fewer jobs at Boeing, whatever. the defense industry at $800 billion a year is a very meaningful part of our GDP. And so while it is absolutely essential that we do that we find that $4 trillion over 10 years, as Simpson Bowles did, the measures that will be part of that effort, we should all be very clear-eyed in saying, yes, it may give us certainty on where the budget's going to be 10 years from now, but each and every one of those measures will ultimately be destimulative to the economy. And that's why the timing is so critical. You know, we got to do it, but we got to be very, very careful doing it in a moment of anemic recovery.
Jim, you outlined three programs, three items that you would, that are naturals in terms of dealing with deficits: the reductions, the increase in taxes, the changing in social programs. I'd add a fourth, and that's just stimulating greater revenue. I think that if you create an environment where businesses want to hire and businesses want to expand and can expand, you're going to create more revenue. You're going to take people off of the unemployment line. You're going to move a market that right now is stagnant in terms of the wage levels within the workforce. People are not seeing increases, but yet at the same time, people are not turning over either. They're not leaving. They're staying in their jobs despite the highest level of job dissatisfaction we've seen in 50 years. Primarily because I think they're afraid if they go into the next company, they're the first one in, they're going to be, they're the last one in, they're going to be the first one out. And I think it comes back to that idea as well that I think if you use Connecticut as a model, not to say that this is by any means proven to be effective and true, but at least in terms of the direction that the state took this past year of trying to provide a greater level of stimulus and impetus for businesses to go ahead and be able to borrow and expand and stimulate that kind of business, but look at it from a federal level perspective, it only serves to reason that it's going to help, at least in terms of the business climate and business environment. Again, that may be naive from a non-politician per se, but I'm curious as to where the federal government sits as it relates to programs like these, even despite the fact that we're in an election year where it's not likely to get a lot of those types of things moving forward.
Yeah, no question. Look, and you'd find broad bipartisan agreement around a lot of things that we ought to be doing to grow the top line number, to grow the GDP. Because, yeah, more GDP means less outlays on safety net programs and more revenues as a result. And some of those programs are, not everybody agrees with this, but most people do, reducing the statutory corporate tax rate, which puts our businesses at a disadvantage internationally. More trade, again, not everybody agrees with that. There's consequences to it, but these are things that hopefully, and regardless of the outcome of the November elections, hopefully we get through November in a way that creates more space in the center, away from the extremes of the two parties, to advance on some of these things that aren't nearly as controversial as other things. And I'd put trade and education and reducing the corporate tax rate probably at the front of that list.
Just to go back what David said a second ago, I think what we really, going back to Hartford here and not Washington, but one of the problems as we see it is, basically wealth has become a four-letter word for a lot of people in Hartford. It's just such a negative thing, and what you need to grow your economy and create jobs is you need wealth creation. And, a lot of our tax policies, or at least there's advocacy groups out there, what I call the spending lobby, they're always looking for more money. They come up with these proposals every year that we think would be very, very detrimental to growing our economy. Corporate tax changes how manufacturing equipment would be taxed. If you look at the personal income tax changes that were passed last year, now the governor did propose increases in the personal income tax, but what the majority party in the legislature came out with really went way over the top by getting rid of the marginal rates that people pay. Once you hit $400,000 in income, it starts to be phased out, and is phased out by $700,000 in income. Now, a lot of people in Hartford think, oh, my God, you make that much money, you live in a gated community, you can afford it. What they don't understand, as much as you try to tell them and convince them, is a lot of those are small family-owned businesses. And if you have $700,000 in revenue over a course of a year, it's not a very big company. But because of the increase in the rate and doing away with those marginal rates, mom and pop, let's say a little computer store or something, and they made $700,000 in income, they saw a 35% increase in their Connecticut personal income tax. Now, what kind of company is going to then invest, they'll have a lot of money to invest back in the business to help grow that business and bring new people on if you see a 35% increase in your personal income tax? And again, some of the corporate tax changes that they propose would have similar effect on what we call economic base industries, those that create wealth because they export their products or they export their services outside the state of Connecticut, bring wealth back into the state. And that's how you grow. But we fight this attitude that if you create wealth, that's a negative thing. And I'm not saying there aren't reasons out there. There's been a lot of excesses that everybody is aware about and talks about. But from a policy standpoint, you can't use isolated instances to develop your policies. And I'm afraid that, if we listen to some of the same voices that we've been listening to in Connecticut, we're going to continue to get on a path where you really create a tax climate that's not conducive to investment, and it's going to continue to have us going surpluses in the good years, but then big deficits in the bad years because we are narrowing our tax base by putting so much emphasis on upper incomes. When bonuses go down, when the stock market underperforms, you're going to see huge swings in revenues. And that's the kind of conundrum that we're setting up for ourselves. We've got to be more aggressive in finding out what can create wealth in this state and what can create wealth in the United States. Just to go back to manufacturing very briefly, I certainly agree that it's going to be advanced manufacturing and not some of the old line textile mills or things like that. But and we hear this from the Pratt & Whitneys of the world, we hear from everybody, as wage rates start to go up in other countries around the world, and with transportation costs being what they are, that people do believe we can at least retain, if not bring back, some of the advanced manufacturing, the high value manufacturing that has a great multiplier effect and creates a lot of wealth and activity around it. So I think if we have aggressive policies at the national level that can make us more competitive and mirror those in Connecticut, we can create that wealth that will bring in the revenues to pay for social programs.
Joe, not only has wealth become a four-letter word, but the word business has become a four-letter word. It's certainly, and I'll talk about where I work in Hartford, there was a time, and I would argue it still continues, that business was the ruination of everything. Business was greedy. Business mistreated their employees. And as long as we allow that perception to perpetuate, that's the whole business climate that we're talking about here in the state of Connecticut will continue to suffer. I've done, with my colleague Senator McKinney in the Senate, manufacturing tours all throughout the state of Connecticut. Hundreds, and there are hundreds of small manufacturers, and by the way, with all due respect, they're not high-level manufacturing. Some of them making springs and nuts and bolts, but guess what? They employ people. They have an average compensation of about $70,000 per, and they employ about 200,000 people here in the state of Connecticut. And guess what? Again, in spite of all what they're facing, they want to grow. They want to hire more people. And they say to us, for God's sakes, just leave us alone. The Unemployment Compensation Fund went bankrupt in October of '09, and they say to us, you folks did nothing about it. So we had to borrow from the federal government, now we got to pay them back. And each one of you in this room, I bet you got a couple of little bills as a surprise recently, saying, oh my God, this bill is just to pay for the interest on what we borrowed, and then the following month you got another bill to start paying the principal. And that's when you had a right to look up to us in Hartford and or in Washington and say, didn't you guys see this coming? Isn't there a way that you could have softened the blow? And not only didn't you do that, but because you didn't have your own fiscal house in order, you just raised my income tax, you took away my property tax credit that I at least got to write off on my income tax. You made it harder for me to hire somebody. You're now telling me when I have to pay that person and the benefits I have to give them. And when I want to do something in government, the attitude is they will come to my shop, my print shop, or my manufacturing shop, and somebody from OSHA or God knows what other letter agency comes in and says, you can't do that, you're out of compliance there, you're in violation there, we're going to fine you here. And they look at us and they say, and you want us to do business here? And a lot of times we say, why do you stay? And they say, I've been offered jobs in South Carolina and in Georgia and in Tennessee. But guess what? I like it here. I grew up here. This is my grandfather's business. My kids go to school here. My mother's in a nursing home here. I volunteer for the soccer team in a little league. Don't make me leave my own state. Help me out a little bit. Use a little common sense. I'm not asking for much. I'm just asking for you to get your house in order so you don't hit me up every 5 minutes. And that's all that I hear small business asking. And so many times we shake our head and say, absolutely, absolutely, we'll get right on it. And we do nothing about it. Or what we do contradicts what we just did in answer to your requests. And unless and until we could look at each other and say, what the hell are we doing? And listen to you as our guide, we're going to continue on this path. And it's not going to be a good one.
Okay. I'm not up in Harvard. It's not me. It's overwhelming in listening to you and listening to the complexity and listening to we all know about the partisanship that you encounter in trying to get things done. So I'm going to erase all of that. I'm going to use my power as the moderator here, and I'm going to elevate each of you. You are now governor, and I'm going to make it even better. What the heck, it's my power. You have both houses, your party. What is the most important thing that you could do to turn things around?
Before or after coming back from Davos?
I guess Davos comes first.
First thing I would do as governor, basically if you have both houses, you're basically king in Connecticut, as is the current governor. What the current governor wants, basically the current governor gets, as we saw during the last session. Whether that's good or bad, we'll leave that up to you. But if you're in that position, and if I were in that position, first thing I would do is I would have an honest discussion with the people of Connecticut, especially the taxpayers, the people who are picking up the burden here, to let them know that I am fully aware of our fiscal situation, and I'm fully aware of the state's balance sheet, and I'm fully aware of the history of the state of Connecticut. We used to, in Hartford, be the wealthiest people on a per capita basis for about a decade or so. This goes back to the late 1800s, and things are vastly different now, but we were known for our Yankee ingenuity. We were known for incredible expertise in defense, aerospace, small arms, insurance, you name it. The list goes on and on. Pretty amazing stuff. We used to be on a per capita basis, because we're so small, 3.5 million people today, an amazing state. Why can't we recapture the greatness and the glory of those past days, despite the fact that we do face a high cost structure and a lot of debt and so on and so forth. And by the way, we're the most indebted people on a per capita basis in the entire country as far as states are concerned. What would I do? I'd let them know that I know about all those things. And we're going to start to dramatically change things. And what we're going to do immediately is we're going to have a lot of executive orders. You can't do an executive order to change the tax structure. You're correct, Joe. Putting in a 35% tax increase over an 18-month or 20-month period was an incredible detriment to the state. A lot of people ended up saying, the heck with Connecticut, I'm out of here. We've got, if not the highest, one of the highest estate tax rates in the country, and a low threshold at which it starts to apply. Those are huge turnoffs. You start losing wealthy individuals, families, partnerships, and ultimately companies that are creating value and have a high net worth. You're going to get into a flat spin, inverted flat spin, and hit the ground, because the tax burden gets bigger and bigger as you start to look at the cost structure and the way things are mathematically in the state with respect to pensions in particular, and you look at the tax base, which is having a real tough time keeping up with that expanding liability, and then you start to erode away at that by scaring wealth and high net worth companies out of the state. You're going to go insolvent. You know, and a lot of people would say we are currently insolvent. And I know a lot of people might say in Washington, D.C., we're insolvent with close to $100 trillion worth of liabilities. So I'd make sure everybody knew that we were going to take a real fundamentally different approach. We're going to lower tax rates. We're going to increase our tax base, meaning the number of taxpayers. People forget that it's not just the rate of tax you're paying, it's the number of taxpayers, okay? Call that N. N times the actual tax rate equals revenues to the state of Connecticut. Raise the number of people paying taxes by reducing tax rates. Guess what? You're going to be net ahead of where you would be if you raised taxes. Eliminate the estate tax. You have a bill in right now to eliminate the estate tax. It does nothing for the state of Connecticut to have that in place. It scares a lot of wealth away, and a lot of revenues that the state is looking for, they don't get. They don't get because people go elsewhere. I would really make Connecticut open for business. Larry's right. We say a lot of things like we're open for business, but how are we really open for business if we're very selectively directing our economic development incentives to this company, that company? We've seen what can happen at the national level. Solyndra is an example. How can we be really open for business if we pass paid sick days? This is something that all of you heard about, and some of the larger companies are passionately against. And they say, you know what, one or two more of these initiatives, we're out of here. Or, you know what, I can guarantee you, we're just never going to hire a new person in the state of Connecticut. I'd change all of that, and then what I'd do is and the governor does have a very good economic development team, there's no question about it. He's put a lot of time and a lot of energy and passion into the whole process, and my hat's off to him for that. But he needs to come back and clean up the rest of our state to make it, in fact, a welcoming place for businesses. That's what I would focus on, and we could change things, I think, quite quickly.
Mr. President?
Yeah, I'm not used to thinking about myself in gubernatorial terms, and I'm a lot less familiar with the activity in Hartford than I am in
No, I'm
Washington,
elevating you
actually,
to
the president.
Yes.
Look, I'm having a little bit of a hard time kind of getting my arms around what is a little bit of partisanship up here, the mention of Solyndra. The fact is that the United States has a very long and successful track record of doing some basic R&D, some basic seed investments that create wild amounts of wealth. The internet was not invented by Al Gore, but it was invented by DARPA, which is a federal program. And you can't tell me how many trillions of dollars of wealth have grown up around the internet. And as Scott very well knows, when you take the approach of making seed investments, and by the way, this is a really interesting debate. I'm not saying that government should be out there acting like a venture capitalist, but when you do take that approach, of course, like any other venture capitalist, you're going to have some successes and some failures. And I would hold the internet and the DARPA activity there up against Solyndra any day as a comparison. Look, at the federal level, first of all, it's not clear to me that if you were governor of Connecticut that you do a whole lot of things a lot differently than this governor has done. And he's gotten significant support from the business community in Connecticut, including for raising revenues and raising taxes. And there were letters sent by many of the larger businesses in the state saying, you know what, those revenues, in as much as they get used to improve our infrastructure, to improve our system of education, are actually economically vigorous things. But you asked me about the federal level, and here I would echo some of the things that Scott says. Look, we can't solve our fiscal issues at the federal level without doing everything we can to do away with the 8.6% unemployment rate. That's got to be job one. You just can't balance your budget with 15 million Americans not paying taxes, not working, and using social safety net programs. So I come back to what I opened with is, today what we should do, but what we won't do, is make significant investments in our roadways and our railways, and those things that are the backbone of tomorrow's economic growth. By the way, I'd include community colleges and education in that. And then, not today, but tomorrow, when we're showing 3.5% positive GDP growth rate, I would do exactly what Scott says, which is, don't raise rates. Don't allow the 01 and the 03 tax cuts to expire, but broaden the base. Take the gunk out of the federal tax code. All of these credits and deductions, which, by the way, we all love. We may not admit that, but we all love, because it's not just corporate jets and tax benefits to oil companies. It's the mortgage interest tax deduction. It's the 35% deductibility of philanthropic contributions. Nonetheless, the economists are almost unanimous around the idea that if you need more revenue, you do it by getting rid of the complexity in the tax code, which in and of itself is a good thing. I mean, why our businesses should have tax departments that are profit and loss centers is not a good thing for our businesses. So, doing that while making the reforms we need to do at the federal level, making the reforms in an equitable way to Medicare and Social Security. At least on the Social Security side, we know how to do it. We did it in 1983. The retirement range is gonna creep up a little bit, and the cap on wages is gonna creep up a little bit. Medicare is a little more complicated, and we're gonna have a heck of a fight over that, but that's important. And then scaling back, $800 billion a year on defense and security. Look, I was in Lower Manhattan for 9/11. I promise you there's no one in this room more sensitive to the threats that this country faces. But we've got some choices to make here. We can either be the world's policeman, I'll echo Ron Paul for a second here, and have high tax rates and not invest in our education and our infrastructure, or we can scale back our ambitions in that regard and say China and Europe and Japan and Korea, you guys are going to play too, because we can no longer afford to spend, $800 billion a year on our defense and security. We put all of those things together and do it in that sequence. And I think we've got a crack at getting the kind of economic growth rates that we saw in 1995, 1996, and showing for the first time since the late 1990s potentially a surplus. Not anytime soon, but we do those things, 10 years down the road, there's no reason why we can't have our budget in order.
I don't know which is headier for you, Governor Cafaro or a majority in the House.
Well, let's pretend it's governor for now. And I say that because Scott pointed it out. Our current governor had the very situation that you are wishing with your magic wand. And I think the first thing that I would do, and I mean this very sincerely, is recognize that I became governor through an electoral process, and that not everybody thought that my candidacy and my positions and my policies were the best, and they voted for my opponent. I happen to be the victor, and in the legislature, we have, my party has a majority, there's a substantial representation by another ideology and another party. And I have to recognize that first, and I have to invite them into the room. Yes, by virtue of the majority in numbers and the position of governor, I might have an advantage over those people, but I can't forget the fact that they not only represent some people, but their ideologies are supported by many people. And they might have some good ideas. And I have to respect that fact and include them as partners, as was done in the job session in October. Now, at the end of the day, as I've often said to our governor, at the end of the day, it's your call. You won. You have that right. You are our governor. You have that right. But if there is a dialogue and a respect, maybe, just maybe, there might be an idea or two that you think, you know what, that's not a bad one. I'm going to include that in our plan. Then everyone buys into it. Then people who might be representing the interests of small business, etc., had their voice said at that table. And those policies, although not perfect, might be ones that get more general support. So that's the first thing I would do, and that's an attitude change. The other thing that I would do as governor is reach out to my executive branch agencies and say, our job is to get to yes. When we have businesses and citizens that come to government for help, our goal has to be, the first thing out of our mouth, and we got to mean it, is how can I help you? How can I help you get to yes? Not to say, this form hasn't been completed right, you're wrong on this, you got to go to another department. That is not helpful. That's a culture. Whether it's something as simple as the way you answer the phone or how you greet the general public. Believe me, it's like the broken window theory that, in my opinion, transformed New York City. It's those little things that count. Then I would recognize as governor the fact that we are not an employment agency. That is not yes, we employ wonderful people to carry out government service, but our first and foremost mission is service to the public. And what we need to do is assist in giving direct service to the public. We have a dual way that we deliver services in the state of Connecticut. It is unique. We have government entities that deliver social services, and we have non-for-profits that deliver social services. I think it's been proved over time that those non-for-profits deliver those services much more efficiently and effectively and at less cost to the taxpayer. We have to make a decision that should be our focus. Yes, we will have government employees, less of them, however, to help administer those services and how they're given. But we can't be in the business of doing everything. The more government tries to do, the less it does well sometimes. And I think starting with those ideas and premises, we would be able to get a budget under control. We would be able to give a sense of stability and security to our citizenry, and most importantly, our businesses, and turn this around. That's my wish list.
Gentlemen, you wish to weigh in? I don't know what to elevate you to.
That's all right. I've never run for office before, so I'll go right to governor. That's fine. Just a couple thoughts. I know I'm going to repeat some of the things that were said, but I think the first thing I would try to do is try to change the way we look at the economy in Connecticut, because I thought for a while that we really look at it and again, I'm not trying to be partisan here, but just in the legislature, the way it operates, it often becomes a zero-sum game. That if business wins on something, labor loses. Or if manufacturers win on something, the environmental community loses. And it's always this win and loss. It hasn't been looked, at least in my opinion, as much how can we have a win-win. That if business can grow, then that's more jobs for people, more tax revenues. And try to change that attitude on how we look at things. And again, a lot of it, I keep using the word bipartisan, but you know, one of the examples, we keep talking about the job session last October. Let me go back a little bit longer, back to 1994, when the Republicans took control of the state Senate. You talked to a lot of the Democratic chairmen from the House, and they'll say the most efficiently things ran was back in 94, because they had a Republican co-chair. We have joint committees in Connecticut. So you had a House Democratic chair and a Republican Senate chair. And a lot of the House Democrats will say the most efficiently things ran and the more they got accomplished was in that 2-year period because they had a compromise. They had to work. The only example, probably the opposite, was the Labor Committee, because you can split a committee in two. And that's what they did because the Democrats and Republicans couldn't agree on labor issues, so it pretty much killed every bill. But other committees didn't want to have that. And probably the best example was Scott's predecessor, Bill Nickerson, was the Senate chair of the Finance Committee at the time, and the House chair, Carl Schissel, a Democrat from Windsor Locks. They got along famously. And we got more done, and things worked much more efficiently because you had to work with people. It wasn't just, it's my way or the highway. So I would try to instill that back into government as much as possible. And I go, this may sound Pollyannish, but I do think we at least have to set that goal. The other thing I would say is that Connecticut is going to be the most aggressive state in the country to grow our economy through innovation, education. I'll give Governor Malloy credit again. As I said earlier, he's brought in really kind of outside the box kind of thinking people to run so many of his agencies. And I would continue to do what they're trying to do, which is reach out to the business community. Dan Esty at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection is working very closely with us and a lot of other business people to look at regulations. Everybody wants clean water in Connecticut. Everybody wants clean air. We can work together to have clean water and clean air, but still be able to do things quickly and efficiently so we can move our economy forward. He's brought in a great person, Stefan Pryor, to head up the State Department of Education. And again, I give the governor credit. He has come forward with an education reform plan. I would push that harder than anything, because if we're really going to be competitive with the long term, we can't continue down the path our education's going down. Tom Friedman, I thought, read a great column in the Times a couple weeks ago saying average doesn't cut it anymore. Average is dead. And our public education system in Connecticut is becoming average. And that's just absolutely unacceptable if we're going to be competitive. So I would be very aggressive on that front. And and Larry talked a lot about, you know, just how hard to get things done and the uncertainty. We're involved with a project. The National Governors Association has selected Connecticut, one of 7 or 8 states, to work on a project around advanced manufacturing. And I've been working with some people in state government. You may know Kip Bergstrom at DECD. And he said one thing he's learned as we've done some plant tours at Pratt & Whitney and elsewhere is that, you know, the world is moving at warp speed, and Connecticut state government is going about 25 miles an hour in the breakdown lane. You know, we're just too slow, we're inefficient, we've got to really change that. And a lot of that's just mindset. And I think these are all things we can get done, but I just try to set that tone that, you know, we are going to be more aggressive than any other state. We're going to do all the things we need to do. We're going to take care of people that can't take care of themselves. We're going to keep a clean environment. We're going to do all those other things, but we're going to be aggressive in having the best trained people, the best educated people, and a state government that really works with the private sector to grow our economy.
Mr. Lewis?
A couple of real fundamental things. I'm not convinced yet that all the aspects related to improving the transportation system, specifically down in the state, have been looked at. I'm not sure you're going to get a double-decker version of 95, or that they're going to put landfill in the Long Island Sound to give us 2 more lanes of a highway. But I'd have to look at that as one component, because I think right now it's a huge choking point for this county and for the businesses in this county. I talk to so many businesses who are, even in this economy, we're hiring, and yet they view the availability of talent as really poor. They can't find people to fill their positions, and that makes no sense to a lot of us, because we hear of what at least is reported as unemployment in the mid to high 8s, and in reality is probably closer to 15 or 16% when you consider the number of people that have dropped out. There's got to be some type of radical and significant program that I'd look to put in place that would provide such significant incentives for businesses to hire and retrain people that you just couldn't ignore that as an option. And right now it's being ignored. $900 a month for a new hire for the next 3 years is what's out there through the state's program. That's a lot of money. And people are just kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying that's not enough for me to go ahead and hire someone who's never done this job before and invest the time to train them. And then last but not least, which I think is just a fundamental loss on the federal and the state level, if I have $100, I'm only going to spend $100. I am not going to go ahead and put programs in place that you can't pay for. And having a budget from the state perspective or the federal perspective that is not sustainable on the basis of how much money you're projecting to bring in versus how much money you're spending. I mean, we do it as business owners. If we were all operating our businesses the way the state and the federal government have operated over the last several years, we'd all be bankrupt right now, instead of somehow continuing along with billions or trillions of dollars in debt.
So, how about you? This is your chance to talk to the governor or the president. I'm going to bring the mic because the cameras need to hear.
Hi, and thanks for joining us today. Right here in Norwalk, in the past week or so, we had a high-tech company called Accelerant, which raised $3 million in venture capital funding. They're one of the companies that was in the Connecticut tax credit program for high-tech companies. And the way that works is wealthy angel investors get a tax credit if they invest in a qualified company. You folks had mentioned or referred to the tremendous wealth that we have here in Fairfield County in Connecticut. That's clearly one way that we've been able to tap into that wealth. And I'm wondering if there are any other ideas on the table for for things that the state or the federal government can do to bring private business investment to the fore the way that program has. And again, there aren't too many examples of it. The jobs tax credit programs have clearly not worked here in Connecticut, but some of them have, and that is one that has worked elsewhere, appears to be working here. And I'm wondering if there are other ways that you guys see immediately to leverage the private wealth around here through government mechanisms.
One of the great success stories, and the General Assembly was very much involved with this, as was the Department of Economic and Community Development, Connecticut Development Authority, and others, is the Film Tax Credit Program, which goes back several years. And if you now look, even just here alone in Norwalk and Stamford and Greenwich, you look at unbelievable investments, fixed investments in plant and equipment, studios. It's all high-tech stuff. It's up there with financial services, and in particular hedge fund managers and private equity managers. They are very, very highly compensated. They don't pollute, basically. I mean, you can make a case that they use a lot of electricity. Okay. But besides that, they don't pollute. They bring a tremendous amount of talent and character and philanthropy to this area. So the way the film tax credit works is fairly fundamental. If you invest a certain amount, you get to take the rate varies depending on what kind of investment you're making, but up to a 25% tax credit, not a deduction, but a credit. So there's a lot of incentive to get someone like Blue Sky Studios, which now has 412, I think, employees in northwestern Greenwich. And Stamford, we know about the big deal with NBC Sports Studio coming here. They're going to be broadcasting the Olympics and NHL hockey. 450 jobs on day one, which is September 1 of this year. This year for $22 million worth of tax credits. So that's another good example. On the venture front, the angel tax credits have worked very well, but Connecticut's not necessarily known for it being a venture capital mecca. The wealth is here. The ideas are here sporadically. There isn't a real center of the universe within the confines of the state borders here. And I think there is something we could do there. There may be something to be said about the genetic research initiative that the governor's taking. He's putting in roughly $300 million into a research center up in Farmington. I think it's way too much to be paying for something like that. But the idea is correct. Start a focal point around which you can start to build an industry so you can create a buzz. Just like Congressman Himes is right. You know, Route 128 is an amazing place. The internet was basically made commercial there, invented by DARPA, but made commercial there. Bay Networks was the first company that ever did it on a large scale. Silicon Valley Research Triangle down in North Carolina, they've all got some reason for them being a center of the universe kind of place for venture capital. We can do that here in Connecticut. I'm not sure it's genomic research, but we could figure out something and follow up on and invest in that theme and get more people interested from a critical mass point of view. Get all the professionals in, the people with the great ideas, and then the venture money starts to flow a lot better, whether you have credits or not.
I'd add to that. I think we've got a lot of work to do to continue to repair and to also make sure that we get the capital markets right. One of the huge competitive advantages this country has over any other country is the liquidity and the vibrancy of our capital markets. And the venture capital community, right on up through IPOs, et cetera, is unparalleled around the world. Now, obviously we had a major dislocation, but you got to be very careful. We have to be very careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You know, all the subprime mortgages, the Alt-A stuff, the securitized paper, the derivatives that were written on the bad real estate paper. You know, that was in a world that was very, very separate from the world that Scott is talking about, and that you're talking about, venture capital, private equity, and whatnot, if I may use that somewhat ugly term these days. This is actually something I get pretty excited about on financial services. I passed a bill that would allow banks to not have to go public until they had 2,000 shareholders as opposed to 500. Going public obviously involves a lot of cost, a lot of compliance. I'm co-author with a Republican from Arizona of a bill that would allow all companies to stay private longer. We're working on a piece of legislation that has strong bipartisan support in the Congress that would create an IPO on-ramp. The volume of our initial public offerings has tailed off pretty dramatically. Now, part of that obviously is real problems in the capital markets. Part of that is Sarbanes-Oxley, other more obtrusive regulatory mechanisms. So the idea is, if you're a $100 million a year startup company and you want to go public, full Sarbanes-Oxley regulation doesn't kick in until 5 years down the road, say. So a lot of the elements that you, as a billion-dollar revenue company, can absorb, you can pay for the compliance and whatnot that you can't when you're a $100 million revenue company. These things would phase in. So I think there's a lot of exciting things happening in Washington in bipartisan fashion, remarkably, to try to make sure that this real jewel that we have, our very liquid capital markets, remain robust.
One of the other things we did in the October session was to give those wealthy investors more opportunity to invest. There was a minimum that they were allowed to invest in order to get the credit of $100,000, and for small businesses, a lot of whom said, we need some investment in our business from outside sources, but we don't necessarily need $100,000 or more dollars. We could use $25,000 or $50,000, et cetera. So we lowered that amount for an angel investor to $25,000, giving that investor more opportunities to invest and also helping small businesses.
Other question?
I learned something here today. I thought that Al Gore invented the internet, but actually it was a Route 128. Another inconvenient truth is that Connecticut is a one-party state here. It's a blue state. So with all respect, we don't have any...
I beg your pardon.
I wish it wasn't. Apologize there, Representative Himes. But the fact is that we passed the largest tax increase ever in the state of Connecticut, and 6 months later, we may be $125 million in the red. How can we have any confidence at all in Hartford's ability to solve our economic problems?
This is exactly what we were talking about before in terms of being able to create the confidence and a sense of optimism for people who are making business decisions or lifestyle decisions to come to the state of Connecticut, raise your family here, have your kids go to school, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't give you much confidence. And again, that's our job, is to make sure that the numbers are transparent, that you're not having the wool pulled over your eyes, which has happened many, many times in the past. We've gotten, and it's been so bad that we've gotten to the point now where, as I mentioned before, we have close to $100 billion in unfunded pension liabilities and other liabilities, and roughly $18.5 billion of just straight normal debt that the state has on its balance sheet. On a per capita basis, that makes us the worst in the country. It's roughly $24,000 for every man, woman, and child, and not every man, woman, and child works to, try to relieve that burden, that fixed burden that's there. It's not fixed, actually. It's growing, unfortunately. So we have to pick away at that, and I would, again, if I get the offer to be governor from Tom again, what I do is I'd go in and I'd say, this is our plan to address these unfunded pension liabilities. I tried last year, myself personally, to have the state be on the hook for more current cash contributions to the pension fund. And just because I'm from a different party than the people that are traditionally going to benefit from the pension fund, they basically just laughed the idea out of the committee room, which is unfortunate, because you need to, it doesn't matter where the ideas are coming from, but you got to solve these problems. Otherwise, we're not going to be solvent in 5 and 6 and 7 years time. The Tax Institute gives us till 2018 before the pension fund is insolvent. We're at 45% funded. If you look at the simple math on that, what the liabilities are over the next 3 to 4 years, even if you have a very sanguine rate of return expectation, there's no way it can catch up with those cash liabilities in 4 years' time. It goes insolvent. So we're going to work on it, and we're going to try to make you feel better about being a Connecticut resident. Anybody who's considering coming here, we're going to try to make it look a lot better, and try to do it in an honest fashion.
There were 3 ways that we handled the crisis that we faced when Governor Malloy took over. And by the way, I do take my hat off to the governor for, he's probably the hardest working person in Hartford, and he wants to solve the problem. We disagree on how he went about it. He chose to go about it, he said, in 3 ways. 1 was to increase taxes to an historic level. 2 was to get concessions out of the unions that he purported to say equaled $1.6 billion. And the 3rd was to cut spending. Well, what we realized is he didn't cut spending, and actually increased by $1 billion over 2 years. The $1.6 billion has now dwindled down. They say they are trying to prove whether it saved half that amount. It is doubtful it saved any more than $700 million than 1.6. But we do know about the taxes. So the fact of the matter is, we spent too much money, more than we took in. We did not taking in as much as we thought we would, and that's why we're in deficit. And it goes back to what I think David said at the beginning as to how we run our households and how you run your businesses. You cannot spend more than you make, and that's what we do. We spend more than we make. And every year we find this is the 6th start of session, the 6th in a row, where I have to look at my constituents and say, we're in rough shape, we're not doing so well. I mean, come on, we just had a $1.5 billion tax increase. But when you spend more than you make, that's what happens.
Just a couple comments real quick. CBIA, we didn't support the governor's budget, unlike some other business groups that did. And it's not because, there were taxes in there. The business community has stepped up plenty of times in the past with surcharges and other changes to help the state meet its budget. We just felt that the proportions were off too much here, particularly with the personal income taxes changes I mentioned earlier. On the business tax side, the corporate tax side, it wasn't horrible. We had surcharges, which we've seen before. However, we just have to take this point in time and move forward. And I think it just gives greater urgency to do some of the hard work of government that people, they roll their eyes if you talk about making government more efficient. But there are a lot of good things happening with bringing lean processes that a lot of businesses have used in order to be more efficient and save money. There's so much, waste, paperwork, other things in government that we have to attack. Now, is it going to close hundreds of millions of dollars in gaps? No. but it gives you an opportunity to push things that otherwise don't get done. And then over the long term, hopefully you can be a little bit leaner, a little bit more efficient, and as Larry said earlier, you got to service the people of the state of Connecticut. That's what you're there for. So, yeah, I mean, on a percentage basis, I don't even know how big the projected deficit is now, but it's pretty small on a $20 billion budget. So what we've got to do is say, okay, here's where we are now, here's what we got to do going forward, and everybody come together to try to solve the problem.
We have about 5 minutes left, so if I can ask you just to give us one reason when we head out of here that we shouldn't go home and slit our wrists, or go to Davos in 1 minute. Give us a rosy outlook.
We know for a fact that we have hit the inflection point at the national level. The economy is on the way back. It's a much slower recovery than we've seen, certainly in our lifetimes, and it may be a truly historically slow recovery for the nation as a whole, which is unfortunate. Also, another characteristic is that the jobs aren't coming back quite as quickly. But the reason to be optimistic is that, like in every 4-year cycle in this country's history, there's always change. There's always some change. You know, people are replaced in office. You get new blood in office at all different levels. And I think that will bring about a certain amount of change in terms of the level of optimism that people have. I think that any kind of change is probably good at this point. And when we get that change, I think business decision makers will be much more optimistic about the future, be in a better position to make decisions about hiring. They'll know more about what some of these future potential costs are, what tax rates are going to be, and they'll go ahead and because there is a lot of pent-up demand for expansion in business and for expanding inventories. And we've seen a little bit of that here recently. We're American. We're still the greatest economy and the greatest country, I would argue, in the entire history of mankind. We're the world's best consumers. We haven't been consuming as much as we are used to for 3.5 years now. We can't wait to go out and buy a new car, go on a wonderful vacation that we may have delayed here for several years. When people feel more optimistic and it's based on something real, we're going to see a big turning point, and that's when we're going to see hiring come back very quickly, and we're going to see GDP numbers that are beyond imagination at this point. Thank you.
I agree. We should be optimistic. I mean, it's no celebration yet because we've still got a long way to go. But look, we've got the most innovative, vibrant people, the best intellectual capability in this country, bar none. I would so much rather be the U.S. right now than be China, where you got 7,000 factory workers in dormitories assembling things. We've got the innovative capacity. We've got the creativity. We've got the intellectual capital. We've got flexibility in our labor markets. We've got, as I referred to earlier, the most liquid and powerful capital markets in the world. And look, we're coming through a very rough time that exacerbated the partisanship. The rise of the Tea Party on the right and the rise of Occupy Wall Street on the left. It's no coincidence that those guys came out of the last couple of years. Everybody is looking around and saying, I lost my job, my mortgage is underwater. Guess what? That creates a lot of emotion and a lot of anger. But we are coming out of this. The manufacturing sector in this country is growing rapidly, adding manufacturing jobs. We've got to do what we can to help that along. We've seen 21 months straight of job creation, not at the levels that we want to see. Last month was 200,000. We've actually managed the balance between regrowing the economy and scaling back our government fairly well. The economists will tell you that we might have grown it at another point or so, 3.8 instead of 2.8. Had we not been in the business nationally of states shedding workers and teachers. And that's, this is something we got to do in the long run. Government has become more than we can afford. But nonetheless, I think we've squared that circle relatively well. And in Hartford, look, you've heard interesting points of view on the governor. I'm actually more distant from the governor than most people in this room. But we now have an activist governor who is aggressive. And you may not agree with everything that he's doing, but he is aggressive. He's put in place people that are first rate, from Stephen Pryor to Dan Estee to the other folks in his cabinet. And again, you may not agree with everything he's doing, but there is direction, there is leadership, and I have real confidence, and not just in the governor, and the folks on my side, but guys like this who are going to provide the pushback on issues like too much paper and whatnot. I'm very bullish on Connecticut.
you've heard a lot about, a lot of reference here to the October job session. And not to overstate what it did, but it was very important in a lot of ways. Substantively, of course, and what we hope it did for, in some small way, for the small business community in particular, but also symbolically, because at a time of gridlock and partisanship, we were able to bring it together. And I, as House Republican leader, one of my tasks is to do the wrap-up speech on our side of the aisle. And when I did, I said, is this one brief shining moment, or is this the first page of a new chapter of the way we do business? And I think I am optimistic, Tom, because we did pull that off, and with the current players. And we showed that when you check ego and partisanship at the door, you can get something done. So I am optimistic, and I truly believe that we can make it not just one brief shining moment, but the first chapter of things to come.
I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning. I think Connecticut just got tremendous, tremendous opportunities. We have had a great diversity of industry in the state. We've got tremendous intellectual capital in the state of Connecticut. We come to these events to talk about challenges, but I'm optimistic, and a lot of it is because of the energy that the governor has brought and his people have brought, and the fact that he did go against the wishes of some of the leadership in his own party when he decided to make the job session bipartisan. So I think if we can continue that going forward, that we are going to do well. And a lot of times the recoveries come when you least expect it. I remember all the economists back in the mid-'90s saying, we were going to have very no growth or very low growth throughout the rest of the 90s and the first half of the next decade. And we had tremendous growth. Now, it was fueled by technology booms and other things. I'm not saying we've got that on the horizon, but nobody was expecting it, and our economy all of a sudden picked up, and we did well nationally. We also did very well in Connecticut. So I think it's around the corner. As Scott said, there's pent-up demand. I think people in Connecticut and people in this country are generally optimistic people, and they don't like to just be pulled down too long. And I think, people are ready to go out and invest and do well, and we just got to continue to make smart choices. We started to make some smart choices. We disagreed on the budget. We can agree to disagree, but we agree with a lot of other things. And if we can continue that same momentum through the 2012 session and beyond, then I am optimistic.
Mr. Lewis, you had the first word, you have the last word.
Sorry to break the train, but I'm not optimistic. I'm not necessarily pessimistic. I think I'm more realistic. I think that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and I think for the businesses that have survived the last 3 years, I think we've become adept at being able to survive versus thrive. And I think that survival right now is far more a realistic expectation versus thriving, because there are so many issues and so many challenges that we all face here. I'll go back on one thing I said. Perhaps it's not that I'm not optimistic. I'm just not strongly optimistic. I think that there's reason for hope because of a lot of the things that are being done in the right direction, but there's a long road ahead of us. And I think right now, I think a lot of the businesses that I know are trying to survive, are trying to see some positive and silver lining in what's going on, are hoping that things don't get worse and that the moves that are made don't make it worse, and that everything that's being done hopefully is going to leave us in a better place, whether it's as business owners from surviving all of this and being able to do more with less, and hopefully when there is a turn in the economy of any significance, that we're all here to be able to share in that.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you for coming. See you on the slopes.